after party tonight?
For years, it was just another forgotten moment from an early 2000s award show. A few seconds of backstage footage that barely anyone paid attention to. But now, after the tragic death of former child star Daveigh Chase, that same clip is being viewed by millions in a completely different way. The video shows a 33-year-old Sean Diddy Combs approaching 12-year-old Daveigh Chase backstage at the MTV Movie Awards and asking a question that has since sparked intense debate online. At the time, nobody seemed to think much of it. Today, many people are asking how a moment like this was ever brushed aside. Bendy as the clip spread across social media, it reopened conversations not only about Diddy and his later controversies, but also about the culture of Hollywood during the early 2000s. A culture that some critics argue looked very different behind the scenes than it did on television. But this story isn't just about a resurfaced video. It's also about a child star who once seemed destined for a lifetime of success. A young actress who voiced one of Disney's most beloved characters, terrified audiences in one of the biggest horror movies of her generation, and appeared to have the entire world at her feet. Yet decades later, her life would take a heartbreaking turn that few could have imagined. So how did Daveigh Chase go from one of Hollywood's brightest young stars to a tragic headline that shocked fans around the world? And why is an old award show clip suddenly at the center of a conversation nobody saw coming? The answers reveal a story far bigger than anyone expected. Long before her name became attached to heartbreaking headlines, Daveigh Chase was one of the most recognizable young faces in Hollywood. At an age when most kids were worried about homework and playground games, Chase was already building a career that many adult actors could only dream of. Her talent was impossible to ignore. Casting directors saw something special in her almost immediately, and it didn't take long before major opportunities started coming her way. Dominant for millions of viewers, she became instantly recognizable as the voice behind Lilo, the spirited young girl at the heart of Disney's hit animated film Lilo and Stitch. The movie became a massive success, and audiences around the world fell in love with the character's humor and emotional depth. Even years later, fans would continue to associate Chase with one of Disney's most beloved stories. But while Disney introduced her to family audiences, another role would cement her place in pop culture forever. Just months later, Chase appeared as Samara Morgan in The Ring, a horror film that left audiences genuinely unsettled. Her chilling performance transformed her from a talented child actress into one of the most memorable young stars of her generation. The image of Samara became a cultural phenomenon, and Chase's performance played a huge role in the film's success. Suddenly, she wasn't just another child actor trying to make it in Hollywood, she was everywhere. Award shows, red carpets, interviews, magazine features, her career seemed to be moving faster with every passing month. Industry insiders predicted an incredibly bright future. Fans assumed they would be watching her on movie screens for decades to come. From the outside looking in, everything appeared perfect. And in 23, at the height of that success, Chase walked onto the stage at the MTV Movie Awards to accept a major honor. It should have been remembered as another milestone in her rising career. Instead, years later, many people would find themselves revisiting that night for a very different reason. The MTV Movie Awards in 23 were supposed to be a celebration of one of the biggest years of Daveigh Chase's young career. At just 12 years old, she had already accomplished more than most actors achieve in a lifetime. Her unforgettable performance in The Ring had captured the attention of audiences everywhere, and that night she was being recognized for portraying one of the most iconic horror villains of the era. When her category was announced, Chase made her way to the stage to accept the award. Presenting the honor were Diddy Combs and actor Ashton Kutcher, two of the most recognizable celebrities in entertainment at the time. The moment seemed come. Cameras rolled, the audience applauded, and Chase accepted her trophy while the presenters offered words of encouragement. Nothing about the exchange appeared unusual to viewers watching at home. In fact, it was just one of dozens of celebrity interactions that took place throughout the night. But according to footage that would later resurface online, another interaction happened away from the main stage. Backstage, cameras captured a brief conversation between Chase and Diddy. In the clip, Diddy approaches the young actress and asks whether she is planning to attend an after-party. Later that evening, Chase appears to respond positively, prompting laughter and a lighthearted reaction from those nearby. At the time, the moment came and went without much public discussion. It wasn't featured in major headlines. It wasn't the subject of controversy. For years, most people either never saw the footage or completely forgot it existed. And that's what makes what happened next so surprising. More than 2 decades later, a clip that once attracted almost no attention suddenly exploded across social media. Millions of people began replaying the footage, analyzing every second, and debating whether the interaction should have raised concerns from the very beginning. But the reason this old video suddenly resurfaced had everything to do with events that wouldn't happen until many years later. For more than 20 years, the backstage clip remained largely forgotten. It sat buried among countless hours of old award show footage, rarely discussed and almost never referenced. Most people had moved on. Daveigh Chase continued her life away from the spotlight, and the brief interaction faded into Hollywood history. Then everything changed. In recent years, Diddy Combs became the center of intense public scrutiny. Lawsuits, investigations, allegations, and non-stop media coverage placed the music mogul under a microscope unlike anything he had experienced before. As public attention grew, internet users began digging through old interviews, television appearances, party footage, and red carpet moments looking for clues about the culture that surrounded him during the height of his fame. Suddenly, videos that once seemed insignificant were being viewed through an entirely different lens. The 2003 clip involving Daveigh Chase quickly became one of those moments. After news of Chase's tragic death spread across social media, users started sharing the footage once again. The timing caused even more people to pay attention. What had once been a forgotten backstage exchange was now being watched by millions who were already discussing Diddy's legal troubles and the broader questions surrounding his past behavior. Online reactions came fast. Some viewers argued that the interaction appeared inappropriate given the age difference between the two. Others believed the clip lacked important context and warned against drawing conclusions from a short piece of footage. Across comment sections, forums, and social media platforms, people debated what the moment meant and whether it should be interpreted differently today than it was in 2003. It's important to note that many of these discussions are based on personal opinions and interpretations of the footage. While the video itself is real, much of the conversation surrounding it consists of speculation and public debate rather than verified facts. But regardless of where people stood, one thing was undeniable. The clip had become a symbol of something much larger. For many viewers, it wasn't just about a single conversation backstage at an award show. It represented growing questions about how young performers were treated during a very different era of entertainment. An era when certain interactions often passed without scrutiny, even when they might spark immediate concern today. And as more people revisited the footage, they began asking a much broader question. If this moment was considered normal back then, what else was happening behind the scenes that audiences never saw? As debate over the resurfaced clip continued to spread online, the conversation gradually shifted away from the video itself and towards something much bigger. Lens people weren't just talking about one celebrity interaction anymore, they were talking about an entire era of Hollywood. The early 2000s looked glamorous on the surface. Red carpets were bigger than ever, celebrity culture dominated television, and young stars were treated like global superstars almost overnight. To fans watching from home, it seemed like a dream world filled with fame, wealth, and endless opportunity. But over the years, a different picture began to emerge. Former child actors started sharing stories about the pressures they faced behind the scenes. Some spoke about overwhelming media attention. Others described exhausting work schedules, constant public scrutiny, and the challenge of growing up while millions of strangers watched their every move. Many of these young performers were expected to navigate adult environments long before they were emotionally prepared to do so. Award shows, exclusive parties, industry events, late-night gatherings, and high-profile networking opportunities often placed children and teenagers in spaces primarily designed for adults. At the time, much of this was viewed as normal within the entertainment industry. Today, many people see things differently. Modern audiences tend to ask questions that rarely surfaced 20 years ago. Were enough protections in place for young performers? Were adults around them paying close enough attention? And how many situations that once seemed ordinary would be viewed very differently under today's standards? These questions have become increasingly common as old footage resurfaces online. In recent years, social media has given audiences the ability to revisit moments that might have otherwise remained forgotten forever. Clips from interviews, award shows, talk shows, and red carpet events are now analyzed frame by frame, often sparking entirely new conversations decades after they originally aired. The Daveigh chase footage became part of that larger trend. For some viewers, the clip represented a reminder of how much public attitudes have changed. For others, it highlighted the uncomfortable reality that certain interactions involving young celebrities rarely received serious scrutiny at the time. Regardless of individual opinions, the discussion revealed something important. People weren't simply revisiting the past, they were re-examining it. And while millions debated what old Hollywood looked like behind closed doors, another question began to surface. What happened to Daveigh Chase herself? Because while the internet focused on a decades-old clip, the actress at the center of the story had been living a life far removed from the fame and success that once seemed guaranteed. And the reality of what came next was far more heartbreaking than most fans realized. While the internet was busy revisiting an old award show moment, many younger viewers were discovering Daveigh Chase for the very first time. For those who remembered her from the early 2000s, however, a different question lingered in the back of their minds. Whatever happened to her? After achieving the kind of success most child actors can only dream about, Chase appeared to be on a clear path toward becoming one of Hollywood's next major stars. She had already built an impressive resume before reaching her teenage years, earning recognition from both audiences and industry insiders. But as the years went on, something began to change. Unlike some former child stars who smoothly transitioned into adult careers, Chase gradually became less visible. While she continued taking on the massive roles that had once made her a household name became increasingly rare. The spotlight that had followed her everywhere during her childhood slowly began to move on to a new generation of young stars. For fans, the shift felt almost sudden. One moment she seemed to be everywhere. The next, public appearances became less frequent, interviews became harder to find, and updates about her career grew increasingly scarce. media as social media exploded throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s. Many celebrities used the new platforms to stay connected with fans and keep their careers in the public eye. Chase, however, remained largely out of the spotlight compared to many of her peers. That absence fueled curiosity. MBUDN, online forums filled with questions from fans wondering where she had gone. Some assumed she had simply chosen a quieter life away from Hollywood. Others believed she was working on projects outside the mainstream spotlight. For years, very little information reached the public, allowing speculation to fill the gaps. Blemda, the mystery surrounding her life, only grew with time. As newer generations discovered Lilo and Stitch and continued watching The Ring, Chase's performances remained part of popular culture even as she herself became increasingly distant from public attention. Her work lived on, but the actress behind those iconic roles seemed to disappear from the conversation. And that's what made the news that emerged years later so shocking. Behind the scenes, reports suggested that Chase had been facing challenges far removed from the glamorous image many fans still associated with her. The successful child star that audiences remembered was no longer living the life people imagined. The reality was far more and when details about her later years began reaching the public, many were left struggling to understand how someone who once had the world at her feet could end up facing such difficult circumstances. As more details about Daveigh Chase's final years emerged, many fans found themselves confronting a reality that was difficult to reconcile with the image they had carried for decades. For millions of people, she would always be the talented young actress from Lilo and Stitch and The Ring, the confident child star who seemed destined for a long and successful Hollywood career. But according to reports that surfaced following her death, the years leading up to that tragic moment were marked by significant personal struggles. Mayan news outlets reported that Chase had been living in extremely difficult circumstances in the months before her passing. The contrast was harsh. A woman who had once walked red carpets and accepted awards in front of millions, was now facing challenges far removed from the glamorous world where she first found fame. The revelation stunned. Many people who had grown up watching her films couldn't understand how someone who had achieved so much at such a young age could eventually find herself in such a vulnerable position. Across social media, former fans expressed sadness, disbelief, and frustration as they reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. Reports also indicated that Chase had been battling personal difficulties for some time. While many accounts that emerged after her death painted a picture of someone facing hardships that were largely invisible to the public. And perhaps that's what made the story so emotional. Being from the outside, people often assume that fame creates a safety net. They imagine that success, recognition, and wealth automatically lead to stability. But the stories of many former child stars have shown that reality can be far more complicated. Behind the awards, movie premieres, and magazine covers, there can be pressures that the public never sees. For Chase, much of her struggle appears to have taken place away from cameras and headlines. While the public remembered the success of her childhood, very few people knew what her daily life looked like years later. Then came the devastating news. Reports stated that Chase passed away at just 35 years old after suffering from serious health complications. The announcement spread rapidly across entertainment news outlets and social media platforms, leaving fans around the world stunned. Almost immediately, tributes began pouring in. People shared clips from her movies, favorite memories from her performances, and messages expressing sadness over the loss of a star who had played such an important role in their childhoods. But as the tributes continued, something unexpected happened. The public's attention returned to that old MTV Movie Awards clip once again. And this time, the conversation surrounding it became even louder than before. Bleed, because now people weren't simply looking back at a controversial moment from Hollywood's past. They were looking back at it through the lens of a life that had ended far too soon. Leon. When news of Daveigh Chase's death broke, the reaction was immediate. Band fans who had grown up watching her movies struggled to believe it. For many, it felt as though a familiar piece of their childhood had suddenly disappeared. Across social media, thousands of people shared scenes from Lilo and Stitch, clips from The Ring, and memories of the actress whose work had left such a lasting impression on an entire generation. What made the news especially heartbreaking was the contrast between where her story began and where it ended. 50 years earlier, Chase had been one of Hollywood's brightest young stars. She had achieved a level of success that most aspiring actors never reach. Yet the reports that emerged following her death painted a far different picture of her later years, leaving many people wondering how someone with so much promise could have faced such difficult circumstances. Tributes poured in from every direction. Some fans remembered her as the voice behind one of Disney's most beloved characters. Others recalled the chilling performance that made Samara Morgan one of horror cinema's most unforgettable villains. Many simply expressed sadness that a life filled with so much early potential had come to such a tragic conclusion. As the conversation grew, another pattern began to emerge. People weren't only discussing her career. They were revisiting the past, old interviews resurfaced, award show appearances began circulating online. Archived photos and forgotten television clips started appearing across social media feeds. Fans searched for answers, context, and moments they may have overlooked years earlier. That's when the 2003 MTV Movie Awards footage exploded once again. The clip spread rapidly across platforms, accumulating millions of views as users debated its significance. Some believed it highlighted broader issues within celebrity culture during that era. Others argued that people were projecting modern concerns onto a brief interaction from decades ago. Either way, the discussion became impossible to ignore. What had once been a forgotten backstage moment was now at the center of a much larger public conversation. The timing of the clip's resurgence, coming immediately after Chase's death, gave it even greater emotional weight. Viewers weren't just analyzing an old video anymore. They were looking at it while reflecting on the life of the young actress at the center of it. And perhaps that's why the footage resonated so strongly. It wasn't necessarily because the clip itself provided new answers. It was because it symbolized something people have become increasingly interested in understanding what life was really like behind the scenes of early Hollywood fame. As millions continued sharing memories of Daveigh Chase, the discussion gradually evolved into something much larger than any single celebrity, any single controversy, or any single video. It became a conversation about fame, childhood stardom, and the hidden costs that sometimes remain invisible until it's far too late. And that brings us to the biggest question of all. As the debate around the resurfaced MTV clip continued, it slowly became clear that the internet wasn't just reacting to a single moment anymore. It was reacting to an entire system. The conversation shifted from what happened in this video to something much broader. What was Hollywood like during that time, and why are we only questioning it now? In the early 2000s, the entertainment industry operated under a very different spotlight. Fame moved faster, boundaries were often less clearly defined, and young performers were frequently placed into adult environments as part of their careers. Award shows, private events, industry parties, and promotional appearances often blurred the line between professional and personal spaces. At the time, much of it was treated as normal. Today, audiences see it differently. Dawned modern viewers are far more sensitive to age differences, power dynamics, and the responsibilities of adults around child performers. What once passed without comment is now being re-examined through a more critical lens. And as more old footage circulates online, that reassessment has only intensified. Malend. But there's an important distinction that often gets lost in viral discussions. And not everything that resurfaces carries a clear or verified meaning. Short clips, out of context moments, and fragmented memories from decades ago can easily be interpreted in multiple ways. Online conversations often mix documented facts with speculation, assumptions, and emotional reactions, creating narratives that may not fully reflect what actually happened at the time. Mants, smat, emotional response. Mants. Still, the emotional response is real. Mang. Still, the emotional response is real. Me. Men. Tact. Me. Many viewers. Revisiting these moments is less about assigning blame to a single individual and more about understanding how different the industry once was and how much it has changed since then. It also reflects a growing awareness of how child stars were managed, protected, and sometimes exposed to environments that would be considered unacceptable by today's standards. In that sense, the resurfaced Daveigh chase clip became something larger than itself. No, it turned into a symbol of how the internet reinterprets the past, how forgotten footage can suddenly take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of present-day knowledge and sensitivity. And while debates about responsibility, context, and interpretation continue online, one reality remains unchanged. Land behind all the discussion, there was a real person at the center of it all. Lemdi, a young actress whose performances shaped childhood memories for millions, whose life later moved far away from the spotlight, and whose story has now become part of a much bigger conversation about fame, pressure, and the cost of growing up in public, which leads to the final reflection. Sometimes, when old clips resurface and go viral, they don't just tell us something new about celebrities. They reveal something about us, about how we remember, how we judge, and how the past changes the moment we look at it again today. Kink? When you step back from everything, the resurfaced clip, the headlines, the online debates, and the wave of reactions, what remains is a story that feels bigger than any single moment. On one side, there's an old awards show interaction that has taken on new meaning. Decades later, fueled by modern conversations, public scrutiny, and a changing understanding of Hollywood's past. On the other side, there's the life of Daveigh Chase, a child star whose work left a lasting mark on pop culture. Long before the internet began re-examining every frame of her career. But the most unsettling part of this entire story isn't just the clip itself, or even the way it went viral. It's how quickly time can change the way we see things. Belinda moment that once passed without comment can later become a global talking point. A career that once looked unstoppable can fade quietly from the spotlight. And a life that began in front of millions can end with questions that never fully get answered. That's why this story continues to spread. Not because there is one simple explanation, and not because every detail leads to a clear conclusion, but because it sits in that uncomfortable space where fame, memory, and hindsight all collide. And in the end, the resurfaced footage is less about providing answers and more about forcing reflection on Hollywood, on the era that produced it, and on how differently we interpret the past once we've lived long enough to see its consequences more clearly. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Sometimes the stories that stay with us the longest aren't the ones that end with clarity, but the ones that leave us questioning everything we thought we understood in the first place.